All right, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to the session. Thank you for taking the time and investment to participate in this week's events. So by way of introduction, my name is Dai Vu. I'm Director of Virtualization Solutions Marketing based out of Redmond. And I have virtualization product management responsibility that expands Hyper-V product management, as well as the development and marketing of solutions built on top of the virtualization platform, which includes disaster recovery solutions, data center consolidation, private cloud computing, and VDI. So what I'm going to do in this session is really just give an overview of the Microsoft virtualization strategy and really communicate why Microsoft is uniquely positioned to take a leadership position. And we have a lot of great sessions in the virtualization track this week. It goes into a lot more deeper detail around server virtualization, VDI, desktop virtualization, infrastructure for private cloud. And so my hope is to really just set the overall context for the strategy and direction. So with that, let's dive right in. So I think you saw Bob Muglia at the keynote this morning reference dynamic IT. I just want to sort of set the right context before we dive into the content. So we've been talking about dynamic IT for about 7 years now. And really what it is really a framework for thinking about how you evolve your IT infrastructure, thinking about where you are today and where you want to be. And we've been evolving the model over the last few years, working a lot with industry analysts, as well as over 12,000 customers, to think about how we develop a model, think about how you take a capability-based approach around where you are today, thinking about the model between basic to standard to rationalized and dynamic. And these capabilities around things like security and access management and data protection and recovery, desktop and server management, et cetera. The interesting thing is that virtualization is not in itself a capability in the model. It's actually a pervasive concept throughout the model. And so what we've seen over the last couple of years is around where customers have deployed virtualization as they progress across the model. Right? So as they go from basic to standard, the focus is mostly around controlling cost, right? Which is virtualizing to increase the utilization of your servers, reduce the power and footprint in the data center. And then as you move from that to standard to rationalize, the focus is more around increasing availability in SLAs. So we're about creating more of a robust disaster recovery capability, leveraging virtualization, and then having more of a streamlined server maintenance process, again, leveraging virtualization. And then lastly, as you move from into the dynamic area, it's around the focus is around increasing business agility. And this is really around thinking about how you can really streamline your workload provisioning, how can you more dynamically reallocate your resources to better serve the business, right? So I want to set that quick context, which is ultimately when we think about dynamic IT, virtualization is a key enabler to really drive the performance of the business. Okay. Let's take a quick view of the market. Certainly there's been a lot of hype and excitement around virtualization over the last couple of years, and certainly there's a lot of interest around what virtualization can provide in terms of some of the capabilities I mentioned in the last slide, which is around reducing TCO, availability, and more agility. But I think this is one of these unique cases where the hype actually matches the reality. And just to give you a context of how virtualization is really changing the landscape, I pulled some data from our friends at IDC. And IDC tracks new server shipments on a quarterly run rate business, but they also track what we call install base, which is this cumulative view of what the physical install base in the market is, taking into account how people would retire older servers. And then they also track this notion of logical servers, so not the host servers themselves, but the virtual machines, the guest operating systems that are running in those host servers. And so if you look at this graph, the little lime green color shows the physical run rate server shipments on an annual basis. The blue area represents that physical server installed base, and then the purple color represents the virtual server install base. So if you take a snapshot of where we are today, there really isn't a big difference between the worldwide virtual server install base and the worldwide physical server install base. But that trend is going to change, continue to change dramatically. And it's driven by the fact that if you look on a run rate business, the virtual servers that are being deployed outnumber the physical servers today, right? And that's going to just increase over time. And then when you take into account factors such as the rate of virtualization, which is what percentage of your new server deployments will be virtualized, and what is the consolidation ratios, what you can fit on a physical host, multi-core and Nehalem, right? And that's going to just widen the gap. So it's to a point now where today, the physical install base is about 25 million servers. That's going to be relatively flat over the next 4 years. But if you look at the virtual server install base, that's going to grow at a rate of about 32% per year to a point where they're estimating by 2013 it's going to be 50 million. So think about that, 50 million compared to 25 million physical servers. So I wonder if that's a reflection of what you're seeing in your environment, which is, are you seeing or can you see a situation in the next few years where the number of virtual servers in your environment is double the number of physical servers? Right? So for a lot of you, I think a lot of this isn't a surprise, which is that really virtualization has really become sort of the default way you're managing your hardware. And it really fundamentally changed, how you think about how you plan, how you buy, how you deploy, how you manage. And this change is permanent. And you can see that in the trend in this graph. So let's talk about the momentum specifically with Hyper-V. So last fall, we launched Windows Server 2008 R2, as well as System Center Virtual Machine Manager 2008 R2. And it really built on a very solid initial release. And with Windows Server, there were a lot of virtualization enhancements in that release. And of course, System Center Virtual Machine Manager exploits a lot of those platform enhancements. So let me cover a couple of these just to make sure we're on the same page. Certainly, we introduced live migration in the fall, so that was a big anticipated feature to be able to move virtual machine from physical host without any downtime. But we also introduced clustered share volumes, which is giving a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you manage virtual machines and LUNs as you migrate those virtual machines. And then we also introduced processor compatibility, which is giving you a little bit more flexibility how you can migrate across physical hosts that may have different generations of processors. So great capability there. We also introduced a number of scalability enhancements, right? So 64 logical processor support. So this gives you the ability to add a lot more hosts on that physical host and gives you more flexibility in terms of assigning CPU resources to those virtual machines. And then, of course, we introduced a number of features around networking and second-level address translation, which is really the ability to offload some of the overhead associated with processing memory and networking. So it really increases the performance of that virtual machine. So again, it really built on a solid R1 release. And I think with some features you're seeing on this page, namely live migration, brought us to parity with some of the market leaders. But some of the performance and scalability enhancements actually positions us very favorably in the marketplace. So how is that translating in terms of market momentum? So specifically with Hyper-V, we're actually seeing tremendous market momentum. We're really seeing broad adoption across the board. So if you actually tie back to our friends at IDC again, IDC has a quarterly tracker, which is probably the most accurate view on a run rate basis what the share of the market is. Microsoft is pegged at about 25% share in the last quarter of reporting, and that's up 3 or 4 points a share year over year. That's compared to VMware, which lost about 3 or 4 points a share during that same time period. And I think there are a lot of factors that are really driving this continued market momentum, right? So the first is around the products. So we touched on R2, but I think there was initially a little bit of a slow ramp for R1 because I think customers had anticipated, well, it's an R1 release, I'll wait to R2, but they found out that R1 was actually a pretty solid release. And then R2, of course, built on top of that. I think the other area is that as we're seeing virtualization become more pervasive, you go into markets, say mid-market or maybe enterprise accounts that are outside of the US, maybe less established, where VMware isn't as entrenched. And what we're seeing is, and for those net new deployments, those greenfield deployments, Microsoft is positioned very well, right? And then lastly, specifically to a lot of the customers who have already invested in VMware, they have invested in VMware actually quite early, maybe several years back. We're actually seeing customers pursue mixed virtual server environments. So they're thinking about the next workload deployed on Hyper-V. And it's easy because Windows Server 2008, if you have access to Windows Server, you have access to our virtualization technologies. And customers are very actively pursuing those new workloads, new projects, and new servers on Hyper-V side-by-side ESX. And just an example of a couple of the customers I see on this page, Crutchfield, fpweb.net, Swedish Red Cross. I mean, these are specific companies in the last couple of quarters who've actually done just that, which is that they are VMware customers that are deploying Hyper-V into their environment. So let's talk about the Microsoft virtualization strategy. It really can be summed up in 3 bullet points, okay? The first is we want to make virtualization as pervasive as possible, which is that our vision for virtualization is really that of ubiquity, really, which is to really think about we want it to be sort of a core component of the technology, a core component of the fabric that touches everything that we do. Think about how the file server or the network stack evolved. We see virtualization playing that same evolution, right? And how we're doing that is through a number of means, right? First is the fact that we actually made Hyper-V a feature of Windows Server, right? Which is the role within Windows Server. And again, if you have access to Windows Server, you have access to our technology. The second piece is that we actually priced for the masses, for mass adoption, right? Which is this idea that, hey, when VMware was the only player in town, they had a big price premium, and they were able to do that because customers were willing to pay for their prices. But now there are other options in the marketplace, and you've seen us talk about how for a comparable solution, we're about 1/3 to 1/6 the price. So we've actually priced it for mass adoption. And then lastly, we've done a number of licensing changes over the last couple of years, things like increasing use rights on our operating system, improving or enabling application mobility, and of course some of our recent changes around VDI licensing, which is really dropping the barriers and making virtualization more of a broad mainstream adoption. The second piece of the strategy is really to preserve existing investments. So a lot of you have a lot of investments in Windows, in System Center, in Active Directory. And as you move from a pure physical to a mixed physical virtual environment, being able to leverage a lot of your processes, your staff skills are extremely important. We leverage that as part of our strategy. The other piece is from a technology standpoint, being able to fit within your existing infrastructure. Again, because Hyper-V is a feature of Windows Server, a lot of your hardware vendors, a lot of your software vendors have done work to certify against Windows Server. And because Hyper-V is a role within the Windows Server, it's largely going to be compatible with Hyper-V and Windows Server. So it's a huge technology ecosystem of the strength of Windows Server. And then lastly, on the desktop side, a lot of you have Windows SA. If you have SA, you certainly have access to Windows 7. And Windows 7 brings a lot of virtualization rights and features, including some of the user state virtualization, but also rights to access hosted desktops with some of the recent announcements. Okay. And then the third component of the strategy is really to establish management as the key enabler, right? Which is, if you go back even a few years ago, a lot of customers were deploying sort of separate management infrastructure to manage their virtual environments. And that might have been acceptable if you were virtualizing just 5% of your infrastructure. But now as it's getting more pervasive and you're virtualizing 30, 40, 50%, you really have to think about virtualization a lot more holistically across your virtual and physical assets. And that's been a key investment area for us, which is really to look at the hypervisor as being there, but really to light up and enable the features. It's really leveraging management. And we do this. These 3 principles apply across both the desktop, the data center, and the cloud. And you'll see me touch on all three principles as we go through the rest of the presentation. All right, let's talk about applications, which is as the evolution of virtualization becomes more prevalent in your environment, there is a situation where, hey, you might start off with virtualizing maybe your file and print, and then slowly over time you'll start to virtualize more of your line of business apps, your business critical apps, and ultimately your mission critical apps. And so a lot of the pundits will say there are certain applications that maybe shouldn't be virtualized at all, right? Maybe it's the high I/O intensive workloads, the highly transactional databases, or maybe it's the horizontally scaled environments like web farms that may not benefit from virtualization. The reality is that even if you go back a couple years ago, a lot of those workloads were primarily test dev and pre-production, but it's really shifted the other way now, where most workloads that are virtualized now are in production roles. They may not be in mission critical roles, but they are moving toward business critical and then ultimately moving to the mission critical side. And of course, we're enabling this transformation, right? So the first was back about a year and a half ago, we announced some changes to our support policy, right? Which is, I don't know if you had run in this environment, but before virtualization more pervasive, a lot of ISVs, if you had to do technical support, would ask you to reproduce an error in a physical environment. So we changed our support policy so that greater than 30 server applications are formally supported in a virtual environment, and you'll receive the same technical support that you would in a physical deployment scenarios. And we now are finding like a lot of ISVs are now embracing that same policy and acknowledging their applications are being virtualized, with us being sort of a lead in that model. The other thing we did at that same time was around application mobility licensing, which is giving customers the freedom to live migrate their apps from one physical server to another and have that license follow that workload within a specific server farm. So additional capability and flexibility to enable that virtualization model. And then lastly, making sure that we invest in management, which is you certainly want to manage your virtual machines in much the same way you manage your physical machines, but you want to focus additionally on the application, which is what's the performance of the application and the workload in the guest operating system. And this is where a lot of the investments and focus have been with our management technology. Let me share with you a couple of statistics as it relates to scalability and performance of Hyper-V. So we had our SQL Server engineering team do some tests around consolidation of SQL Server workloads. And so they took a 16-core HP DL585 server with second-level address translation. And what they did was for 4 virtual machines, each having 4 virtual processors, they basically ran a very complex workload. It's basically TPCE, if you're familiar with that. It's a very complex financial OLTP workload. And what they wanted to measure was, what's the scalability and throughput of those workloads as you add more workloads to that server? So the way to read this chart is if you've actually focused on the left side of the chart, the bars represent the utilization of the processors on the server. And then the red line is sort of the throughput per VM. So it's actually measured in batch requests per second. Okay? And what it shows is for 4 virtual machines, each with 4 virtual processors, you basically have pure linear scale. Right? So that red line is pretty much flat, basically meaning that you're getting throughput on a per VM basis the same whether you virtualize 1 VM versus 4. Now they took that test to the next level, which is what if we overcommit the CPU resources? Now we'll have 8 virtual machines, again with 4 virtual processors each, so you now have 32 virtual processors, but only 16 logical processors in the server, right? And now what you're seeing is only a slight degradation in terms of the throughput. Not very meaningful at all. And so what you're taking here is an example of a high complex transactional workload consolidating 8 VMs and showing almost near linear scale. Let me give you another example. Earlier this year, we did some performance scale testing with Intel, specifically around I/O, and we actually achieved some record-breaking performance for iSCSI. And so what we did was we took a 4-core, standard 4-core server, and with Hyper-V and Windows Server 2008 R2 and the Microsoft SCSI initiator, we took 10 guest VMs and through some networking enhancements, both with VMware VMDQ, measured the IOPS to those guest virtual machines to the iSCSI targets. And so what we were able to achieve was 715,000 IOPS. And as you look at this graph, it's actually the light bar is the virtualization IOPS, and then the blue bar is the native IOPS. So you'll see that greater than 8K block size, we actually achieve equivalent to native throughput. Now, 700,000 IOPS, I think, equates to sort of a storage bandwidth about 3 gigabits per second, which may be overkill for a lot of your workloads. But I think what this demonstrates is addressing some of the skepticism that Hyper-V and virtualization in general can be for these high I/O-intensive workloads. And at the same time, these technologies give you the capabilities to scale with some headroom. All right, let me cover management for a second. So as I mentioned before, this is one of our core tenets, right, which is really thinking fundamentally the belief around our systems management strategy is that although virtualization does introduce some additional levels of complexity, it doesn't really create fundamentally new categories of management. The thinking here is if you kind of take it down to the basics, a virtual server is really a server environment first and a virtual second. So as such, you got to think about how do you manage the full server lifecycle management across both physical and virtual assets. Right? So if you had to patch an operating system, would you use a different tool if it was sitting in a physical host versus a guest VM? You'd probably want to use the same tool. Same thing with thinking about how you monitor, right? If you monitor a virtual machine, do you only want to monitor just whether the VM is running and what system resources it's using? Or would you additionally want to see how the application or workload is actually running inside the VM, right? So it's this notion of really having this converged, unified view across physical and virtual really creates a differentiator for us. And in this past year, we've actually introduced 2 new capabilities as part of the Systems Center Management Suite. The first on the bottom is Opalis, which we acquired in December. And this is really an IT process automation capability, workflow, runbook automation. And then we have Service Manager, which we introduced recently, which is really thinking about how do you create some best practices in terms of change and incident management or change management. So you're taking a very sort of deep and broad systems management portfolio and just gotten stronger to really create this end-to-end service management for the data center. So, as I mentioned before, one of the key features that we introduced in VMM 2008, actually R1, was something called Performance and Resource Optimization, or PRO for short. And really what it is it integrates with System Center Operations Manager 2007 R2 to really give you sort of a dynamic monitoring capability. So what you can do is you can capture alerts. And these alerts can come from a number of different sources. And once you have these alerts, you can establish these operational policies that say, hey, if this alert exceeds some acceptable threshold, I want to take some type of remedial action. And that remedial action could be to initiate a live migration, could be to provision a new virtual machine, could be anything. And what we're seeing is that the beauty of Pro is that it's a completely open and extensible framework. So not only can our customers develop custom management packs for Pro, because you have the visibility and deep knowledge of how that application should perform, but also our partners are embracing it as well. So if you actually look across these areas, we've actually had partner invest and actually made available management packs that enable Pro, right? So for example, and I won't be able to go through all of these, but Quest has developed a management pack that helps manage non-Microsoft Windows workloads. F5 and Citrix, for example, have developed management packs that have looked at network utilization and how you manage the resources more effectively. We have Brocade and Emulex, for example, that are measuring link congestion on an HBA, and maybe you can initiate a live migration if things are heavily congested. And then you have HP and Dell, for example, who are leveraging the knowledge of the hardware. They might get like pre-failure alerts on the hardware and then evacuate those virtual machines based on these alerts. So a really flexible, strong capability that our partners and our customers are embracing. So let me, at this point, invite Kenan Owens, who's going to come on stage and demonstrate one of these management packs for Pro.
Thanks, Doug. Thanks. So my name is Kenan Owens, and I am I know. It's number 2 if the guy's still here. Hello? Can you hear me? Okay, well, I'll scream it out.
Do you want to just use
here it goes. All right, my name is Kenan Owens, and I'm a technical product manager on the System Center and Virtualization team here at Microsoft. And what I'm going to like to do to show you today is the integration of our Pro capabilities with and what they can do, which is more than just moving virtual machines around. As Di talked about earlier, we can start virtual machines, we can shut and move VMs off of a machine and then shut that machine down if we need to for pre-failure alerts. Well, we can actually help administrators lower the cost of managing their systems and being able to take corrective or preventative action prior to an error condition occurring. And what this means is that not only can we rebalance the workload when things happen, like load changes, but let's say I'm going to start using up all of my disk space and I need to free up more disk space for my virtual machines as they grow with these dynamically expanding disks. We can do things like that. So in this example, I have a VMM machine right here. And in this VMM machine, I have a virtual machine, ConSTA03. And if we look at the properties of ConSTA03, what we're going to see is that the hard drive of the virtual machine, in this example, is stored on the N drive. And that N drive is a LUN that's serviced up by a NetApp filer, a FAS3070 actually. If we look at what that NetApp actually is, if we look at the physical LUN characteristics that virtual machine is stored on, it's a 40 gig LUN, but it's actually running on a volume that's 30 gigs. So if I expanded the VM's VHD file to be larger than this 30 gigs, I would have a problem. And the reason I could do this is because I can create the LUNs larger and then I can add storage later as I need that storage. So I can allocate and reallocate my storage because of the benefits of running on shared storage. What I'm going to do here, though, is show you how we have leveraged a pro tip created by NetApp at Appliance Watch. They call it the Appliance Watch Pro, which will monitor the actual storage use space. And when that use space hits a certain threshold, it will automatically, it'll kick off a pro tip, and you can set if it automatically or manually you recover from it. A pro tip to expand the volume on the fly to accommodate the space needed. So in Operations Manager, I have a few views for my NetApp storage, and one of the views is the fact that it can see the storage related to my Hyper-V virtual machines. So I can actually see the storage management that ConSTA03 is stored on a LUN, STA03. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy files onto that server to take up the extra disk space. So I have these 2 gigabyte files right here. And if we look down here, we can see I have a little bit over 2 gigs free. So I'm going to copy these 2 gig files on that server, and I'm going to paste them right back into here to take up more space. I'm going to expand that VHD file. Where I might use this if I have a lot of different, if I'm doing, say, VDI or something, I want to create VMs that expand on the fly. I can put them on one LUN, have multiple VMs on there, and make that LUN grow only when I add data to it. So I've copied those virtual disks over, and what we've seen is that under the alerts, when that thing gets to 99%, so if we refresh the LUN, what we're going to see is we're over 95%. This pro tip actually will kick off at 97%. So if I keep refreshing the LUN, I should see this grow as that copy. And we see we got a warning because we passed 95%. I'm not having the pro tips kick off on warnings, just on error conditions. Now we're over 97%. So what we're going to see that the operations manager is monitoring the system. It's looking at the virtual environment, and when it sees that this thing has passed 97%, and it checks it about once a minute, it'll kick off the pro tip, and we'll be able to expand that LUN on the fly. So let's give it a few more seconds here, and we'll see this pro tip kick off. What I can do, I can click back here into Virtual Machine Manager, and we haven't seen that pro tip kick off, but there it just did. The data volume space exceeded the threshold. So right now, it's over 95%. And what we can do is if we implement this pro tip, it'll expand the volume to now leave 85%. So we'll leave 15% disk free instead of 2%. So I'll implement the pro tip, and it's going to kick off the pro tip. Data on tap is going to go and log into the NetApp filer, and it's going to expand the LUN on the fly. And if we come back to this NetApp Storage Manager, we can see that the LUN is still being expanded here. And give us a few seconds. This thing will kick off and say it's done. And at that point, we'll be up to date. So let's go Control 1 here. And the pro tip is now running. And we refresh here. And it'll go. So that's what it is. What this shows is that not only do we just look at the virtualization layer, but we look at the infrastructure around it, and we can take corrective actions and protect the environment, even if it has nothing to do with moving virtual machines around. And what I'll do, just to save time, when I come back up for my second demo, we'll all tab back to here and you can see it. But I'll just leave it back to die right now.
All right, thanks. All right, thanks, Kevin. So let me move forward and talk about how virtualization is evolving the data center. And frankly, this is going to be a little bit transition into thinking about cloud computing and the role that virtualization plays. So I'm going to flip through this fairly quick because I think you understand the concept, which is the traditional data center. I think most of you have moved beyond this, but this is really the single app per server model where you have grossly underutilized server. And as you move to the virtualized data center, it's really increasing that server utilization up and decreasing some of the management costs. But some of the challenges, even in a virtualized data center, is that a lot of your processes are still very manual. And as you virtualize, you tend to have these islands or pools of virtualized resources that aren't necessarily shared. So being able to scale up or scale down as the business required, you're constrained to some extent. And that's what happens when you move into more of the private cloud computing scenario. So this is the notion that you can have sort of an elastic shared resource pool where you really deliver to your business units IT as a service. Right? And this gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you onboard resources. Maybe it might decrease how you manage because, for example, you might be able to have these business units provision their own capacity once you actually onboard them and sort of specify storage, compute, and network. And then the other stage, of course, is now you start to leverage the convenience and scale of a public cloud. Right? And this is where you're no longer bringing assets into your organizations, and it's CapEx, and therefore you depreciate those assets. More around the shift to OpEx. It's more around paying what you use. It's similar to how you would actually consume electricity from a utility company. So we see virtualization as being a key enabler in driving this data center evolution. It's a key component as customers move to the cloud. So let me actually bring Kenan back on, and now he's going to show how we're innovating System Center to work with this evolution of the data center.
All right. So let's see, this thing didn't go. Let me just implement this, and I'll go do the other one, and we'll come back. Within the data center, you currently understand VMM 2008 R2 manages virtual machines, whether it be VMware or Microsoft. They manage that virtualized environment. With the VMM vNext, we're looking to increase what that capability can be. We're bringing in those cloud principles that you've been hearing about already today, and you'll hear about all the rest of this week. And those cloud principles that relate with virtual machines, whether they be virtual machines on premises or off premises, whether they be virtual machines themselves or they be applications that have been virtualized that we're going to run on the server, or what we talked about a couple MMSs ago, server app V. What we want to do is be able to decrease the amount of administration for deploying these services, as well as decrease the complexity within your organization. If we look at this environment, I have a system with multiple, oh my goodness, this is going to be tough. I have a system with multiple servers on here, and oh, the resolution. Yeah, let's do this. Oh, here we go. And what we can do is we can launch. This is a content technical preview, so it's going to have, it's not going to have all the different bells and whistles, and one of them is scroll bar it's missing. But what we can do is see within this library that we have multiple types of virtual machines created. The first one is we have application packages. These are packages of applications pre-created and configured that when I need to deploy that application, I create a new virtual machine and I deploy that application onto it and I can now run it. It means that I can limit the amount of hard drive images or virtual base OS images down to a bare minimum. I have one here for any type of application type server, one for a web services environment, and one for a SQL environment. I've now, instead of having 30, 40 different base images, I've narrowed it down to 3. And depending on the application that I'm going to deploy, if it needs web services, I can deploy the web server OS image here. If it's an application, I can deploy that application OS image and then deploy the application service on top of that. And if it's a database type of environment, I can deploy the base SQL image and then deploy the SQL DAC contents onto that. So I have this composable image capability. So if we look in this library, we can create not only just a virtual machine, but we can create an entire service. So I can click on this button here and create a service. And this service that I'm going to create here is going to be just a generic 3-tier application. This 3-tier application is going to need multiple environments. It's going to need to have, and I can maximize this out, it's going to need to have multiple networked environments, one network accessing the physical internet, the DMZ, and another one for internal network communications. This 3-tier application has, and I've created this customized 3-tier application. It has a web tier, an app tier, as well as a database tier. So what I can do now is deploy the type of machine template for that application onto the proper environments. So I'll take my web application and I'll deploy it up here to the web tier. I'll do the same with my application environment to the app tier. So if I had multiple different app tier environments set up down below here, I could pick the one that was appropriate for this application. And I can do the same thing with the database tier. Now, one of the important things about this is that this application, the database server, in my production environment, may need, I'll do it down here. It may need some, it may need high priority storage. In production environment, I want my database on a high I/O capability storage. But if this was a development environment I'm deploying out for one of my development teams, I could just do standard performance, put it on the cheaper storage. So I could determine, because of the application, what tier storage, what tier services it gets, resources it gets applied when I create this machine. The other thing is this application, though it's a 3-tier application, each of these tiers may have more than one server. So what I can do is I can actually, in, say, my web tier, I can say that, well, this web tier application, I want to start with 3 instances. But I want to never to go more than 10 instances. So I can create a maximum of 10 web servers. So this one won't create 10 web servers, but it will create VMs up to 10 web servers as the load in this load balanced web server environment changes. I'll default to 3 because I want 3 of these to start. So I can create this application, set it up, determine how many it can deploy. I can even set the minimum number so it'll always have at least 1 in this environment. And then I click deploy, and I can deploy that application. So I've now deployed this 3-tier environment with it'll start with 3 web servers, 1 app server, and 1 database server. At that point, then, I can also look at the resource point of view itself and see what's happening with these services. So if I click on services here, I can see that I have multiple services deployed. In this web service tier app that I created right here, I have those 3 web servers, the app server, and the database server. And they're deployed as a service with the entire thing, with the entire systems there. So I can look at them and say, this service is running okay, so I can continue on and manage other things. Or if something happens, I can deploy and go into that service and find out which one's having an issue. I go to the host environment, and I can see the different hosts that I have out there and see that we're managing and monitoring multiple virtualized environments from the same web service location here. What I'm going to do now is go back to the library, because one other thing that we can do is we can actually monitor these systems and see if they're in compliance. As new patches come out, every patch Tuesday or whatever, I need to make sure that these are up to date. And to do that, I can scan my templates. And by scanning my templates, I can see which of these systems is up to date, has all the current patches for that application environment. So it'll go through and scan, and it will see which of these servers are running okay and which of these servers I'm going to need to patch. By patching the templates, then any new virtual machines that come out, they'll be deployed with the correct and proper template. What we see is that the application server, that standard image, needs 2 patches. So we'll go through that same compliance tab, and we'll say remediate. And it will deploy that template out, update the patch, and then re-templatize it so that I will now have a virtual machine that's ready to go and with the proper patches available to it. Now the other thing is I can then take this environment and scan my running virtual machines and see whether they're in compliance, and any ones that aren't in compliance there, I can remediate those with the updated patches here. So with VMM vNext, we're looking at a cloud principled environment where we're treating the service, and that's the tier that we're looking at, so that you as an administrator can deploy and provide services to the levels that you need, and we'll ensure that we can make sure those resources are available by increasing or removing the capacity within the requirements that you've set. So thank you.
All right, thanks, Kenan. So I think Bob Mu presented it this morning, so I just want to reiterate what is our cloud computing approach, which is that as customers are looking at ways to sort of bridge their on-premise software deployments and leverage some elements of the cloud, our strategy is really to provide the tools and the guidance to really allow customers to move to cloud computing on their own terms. Right? So there may be certain workloads like email and collab that they'll quickly move to the cloud, like, for example, leveraging the Microsoft BPOS service. But there could be other considerations around things like data sovereignty and data control, which require you to move some of those workloads and keep them on-premise. But at the same time, leveraging some of the capabilities we have in market today with System Center, Windows Server, SQL Server, and Hyper-V to develop these private clouds on-premise. And then certainly looking at Azure as an application development platform to develop potentially these high-scale distributed applications that may complement or augment your existing on-premise software. Regardless the pace at which you consume cloud computing and where you deploy your infrastructure and apps, our approach is really to provide this common integrated approach, right? Which is that we want to have a common identity model. We want to have a common set of management tools that help federate and manage capacity across the different locations. We want to be able to leverage the same development tools, right? You saw some of the announcements in terms of Azure and .NET, and being able to leverage some of the Visual Studio 2010 IntelliTrace capabilities, right? You want a common, coherent framework to be able to consume these and move these cloud services capabilities, leveraging a lot of the assets you already have. Okay? Now, depending on where your stage of evolution is, the idea is that you can leverage virtualization and start preparing for the cloud today. Right? So the first is, if you haven't already, certainly begin to build up the skills for virtualization. Right? Then you can start to think about how you might standardize on a server architecture. And the idea is that you have these standard building blocks that you can help scale as the organization grows. And if you haven't already, really think about a standard management capability that spans both your physical and virtual assets. And then start to think about how you fine-tune processes in people interactions. So one of the capabilities, for example, is you may want to automate the process to provision capacity to the business units. But the challenge there is if you automate that process and you don't have the processes and communications sort of fine-tuned before you do that, it's going to be difficult to roll out that capability. And then as you move to a cloud computing model internally, you can start to think about how can we architect services in more of a shared model, extract compute resource pools. And one simple deployment example is to take different business units and leverage them and virtualize them on the same set of infrastructure. Okay? Let me now shift gears and talk about the desktop. Okay? And in some ways, desktop virtualization is very similar to server virtualization, but in some ways it's also very different. And in fact, in some ways, you don't want to consume desktop virtualization the same way that you're consuming server virtualization. So one of the things we think about is we have a vision for the desktop in terms of the optimized desktop and user-centric computing. And these are models that help us think about how you create more of a flexible computing model that makes the desktop and applications more manageable. Right? So the optimized desktop is thinking about a comprehensive capabilities to create a secure and well-managed desktop. User-centric computing is thinking about how can I deliver the right resource, the right applications, the right data to any user, anywhere, on any device. Right? This is quite different than maybe perhaps other server virtualization vendors who might approach desktop virtualization more of a generic workload on their hypervisor. Right? And if you kind of think about the history of desktop virtualization, certainly one of the emerging or early deployments of desktop virtualization is terminal services, and with our partner Citrix, XenApp, which is that we've been delivering session virtualization, presentation virtualization for over 10 years, and many of you have it in your environment today, and it's really the foundation for how you think about removing some of the location dependencies and creating remote applications and desktop access. Oops. Sorry. And I think it's because of this sort of broad-based view of how we approach the delivery of desktop and applications. It really gives us a unique approach into the marketplace. So when you think about desktop virtualization, it really is a broad set of capabilities. Right? So here's on the chart here is a traditional desktop stack where there's very tight linkages between the hardware, the operating system, the application, and data and user setting. And at the end of the day, what desktop virtualization is the set of capabilities and technologies that create that level of abstraction between the different layers. And so this is a high-level overview of some of the capabilities we have that address that virtualization set of layers, right? So on the data, user, and settings, in Windows 7, we actually have roaming profiles and folder redirection. On the application layer, we have AppV from our acquisition of Softricity that removes the application footprint from the operating system, really brings patch and update management to a central location and reduces the cost of delivering or deploying application to the different endpoints. And then with remote desktop services, we have the ability to deliver either applications or desktops using sessions, which is really being able to present a desktop to the endpoint device and really create a seamless experience with the rest of their applications that are running locally. Now, at the OS layer, we have a couple of options, right? First is MedV, Microsoft Enterprise Desktop Virtualization, which is a management solution that builds on top of Virtual PC. And the deployment scenario is typically if you have core applications that are running on XP, for example, that haven't been tested or won't run in Windows 7. MedV enables you to run operating systems side by side and access those applications in a very seamless way from your Windows 7 experience. And it provides some sort of enterprise management capabilities on top of that in terms of policy and deployment. And then, of course, there's VDI, or hosted desktops, where you're running whole desktops with user personalization and control in the data center. And so we think about these set of capabilities. The first set that I mentioned, which is really about data and user settings and application, these are really capabilities you roll out to reduce the total cost of ownership. And these are things you could deploy to a very broad base of desktops, where you could actually see immediate TCO benefits. And then based on the composition of your users and the needs and requirements of the users and the IT organization, you can start to bring out or deploy a set of these capabilities to certain segments of your users, whether it be VDI, session virtualization, or MedV. So ultimately, what we see is a scenario where there really isn't a one-size-fits-all for desktop virtualization, right? You'll segment your users, and the deployment model that you have for your desktop virtualization technology will be driven by a couple of factors. Those factors might be, what's the richness of the desktop experience? What's the level of terms of control and access to the data, right? And so we will see a sort of a hybrid or mixed environment where you'll see some virtual desktops, hosted desktops, traditional distributed desktops, maybe a combination where you're streaming apps to the local desktops, all managed by a single coherent management framework. Because at the end of the day, desktop virtualization should just be a part of your broader desktop management strategy and approach. And that strategy and approach needs to take into account how you manage applications, how you manage your hosted desktops, your distributed desktops. And just like we saw in the management of the servers, your traditional tenets in terms of managing the desktop lifecycle, how you patch, how you manage, how do you health monitor the endpoints, how do you make sure that there's compliance in terms of the configuration. These are things you want to consider in the virtualized world as well as the physical world. And that's why having really a common management framework that manages across all your desktop deployment models is extremely important. That's what System Center provides. So at this point, let me invite Jeff on stage to show you this consistent management framework.
Great, thanks, Matt. You guys hear me okay? Okay, well, thanks for having me, Di, and thanks for joining us today. I'd like to spend the next few minutes and show you how we have also integrated heavily the desktop virtualization technology right inside the System Center. Some volume there? Hello, hello, hello. There we go. That better? You guys hear me okay? Head's shaking, no. How about crank the volume up for me? Maybe. Better? How about this one? How's that? Yeah. I was hoping you wouldn't hear me, then I can just sneak off stage. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple of things. First of all, I want to spend the first half of this demo and show you what you can do today. And that really is focusing on what is available in the market today from System Center to help you with things like Windows 7 in the space around desktop virtualization. The second part of the demonstration, I want to show you how we are also investing heavily moving forward in our next release of Configuration Manager to show you just exactly how much we are embracing client virtualization. So let's begin with looking at what you can do today. Get the water away from the keyboard. And what I've got in front of me here is an actual environment that is a Windows 7 environment. And just make sure I'm sitting on the right guests here. Yeah, okay. So in my client here, I'm actually running a Windows 7 environment. And what you can see here is I've just got the control panel open. This is a Windows 7 environment managed by System Center. Now, part of the deployment we've done here is, actually, I'm actually on the wrong set of VMs. These are the ones I want to show. OK, so what you're looking at here is the Configuration Manager console. And I'm going to jump over and show you the client first, because I'm going to show you a deployment of an application that's been virtualized. And that's what I want to show you. OK, so what you're seeing here is a Windows 7 client. And this is actually an environment that is running both application virtualization and physical installations. What you can see here on the bottom left is I go to my Start menu. I've actually deployed Office 2010 in a sequenced format that is virtualized right on the machine here. So we've actually deployed Office 2010 on this machine in virtual format. What I've also deployed to this machine is up here on the top of the nav. You can see the Start menu shortcuts for Office 97. I'm able to do this because both of these applications have been sequenced. That's a concept within application virtualization. And so the apps aren't talking to each other. They're talking to the operating system, but they're not talking to each other. And these can run side by side. This is something you couldn't do as a physical installation. So I'm just going to launch Access 2010 and 97, and those are going to fire up here and run side by side. And you can see there I'm running both instances on the same machine of two different versions of Office. Now, the way I can achieve that is because we've isolated the apps. And this is one of the things Di's mentioned about creating flexibility in computing models and allowing applications that have compatibility challenges to be deployed side by side. Well, what if we actually wanted to deploy some additional applications? And if I go back into my environment here, I'm on my config console. When the Softricity technology was acquired by Microsoft, the product group from Softricity went into two places. They went into the Windows division, and they went into System Center, because we knew that application virtualization had to be managed and had to be delivered within a tool that was very management focused towards the client. What you're seeing here in front of you is a list of applications that are both physical and virtual, side by side within our product. So the same way today you're doing full installations of applications through MSIs or scripts, you can use that same process to actually deploy virtual applications. And we're seeing them in the same way here. Now, the difference is at the advertisement level, typically you would have done installations that run setup EXEs, they call MSIs, that kind of great stuff. The kind of stuff you'd see underneath, maybe if I just open up Adobe Reader over here, and I open up the properties of the program. All this stuff down here, we're firing the XE with the command line property. That's an installation. Well, we're not doing that with virtual apps. If I go down and look at one of my virtual applications, and I'll look at my advertisements, I'll just open up maybe Word 2003 here. You can see that program folder is missing. And that's because we're not doing an installation. We're simply just presenting the app in a virtualized format. Now, one of the other cool things to differentiate with, just to show you the difference we treat them with, is when I look at an application that's been virtualized, at the properties level, I can actually define on the right side there the ability to either download that application and let it run on a laptop, maybe going off the network like you've come here to New Orleans with. Or if you have call centers or machines that are fairly connected all the time, you can allow that application to be streamed as well across the network. So we have built that technology right inside Configuration Manager. And you're treating the applications as deployment properties the exact same way as a full install. We default, obviously, to the download and execute locally because we don't want to assume you have that network connection all the time. One of the things we've also done is not only with picking up Windows 7 support in our recent release of Configuration Manager, we've also brought along the support for Application Virtualization 4.6. Now, if you're in the app view space right now and you're investigating some of this technology, that was a pretty big release because it picked up things like 64-bit support and shared cache and things. So a great step for us to bring along as far as embracing the latest releases. The other thing that I'll leave you with just before I finish this portion of the demo is that in addition to picking up Win 7 support and AppV support, we've also introduced some improved client policy evaluations. What that means specifically to virtualization is if I have an ability now to advertise an application to a user or a system they're running on, and the typical history of SMS or config man was it's a kind of a black box and it would happen kind of in the next 24 hours or whenever the next client polling happened. Well, we've actually taken out a significant amount of time in our client policy buffers for at login time to instantly validate user policy. And so if you deploy things like a virtual application, simply logging off that machine and logging back in, you will actually activate the user policy refresh, and you'll see those deliveries happen. So in an application virtualization scenario, that is a significant improvement for us to make and achieves complete parity with us from a traditional AD and AppV publishing methodology. So that's a quick scenario there for you. Moving forward in ConfigMan V Next, as I transition my demo here, we're going to take that one step further because we know you guys don't reboot your machines that much anymore. You don't even log out that much anymore. You're putting the lid down the laptop and you're bringing it back up again. So in our next release of Configuration Manager, we're going to do those policy checks when the actual desktop is simply unlocked. That's not necessarily a login event. That's actually just a desktop unlock. So again, taking it that one step further because we know your client computing patterns are changing. OK, that's a little bit about the current stuff in market. Let's take a look at what else we can do moving forward in our next release. Just bring up the server here. OK, so what you're looking at here is the new console for the next release of System Center Configuration Manager vNext. This is currently in beta today. It was about 2 weeks ago we released this. So you can download this now and experience it yourself. You may notice the console looks a bit differently. That's because we've departed the MMC console experience. Many people would probably feel a bit bummed about that, but this is a great step for us, and it brings us into parity with other products like you've seen from Canon already today. One of the things I want to highlight for you with respect to virtualization technologies is we are thinking about user-centric client management in our next release of Config Manager. What that means is we are thinking about defining boundaries and relationships and even rules for delivery based on who you are, the piece of hardware you're using, and the connection between those to our infrastructure. Once we have created those relationships, which we call user-device affinity, we can determine through those rules, dynamically add authentication or add policy refresh, what scenario you're inside of. And then in that process, determine what format of application to deliver to you. Now, this is extremely powerful because one of those formats could be virtualization. Let's take a look at how that comes up inside the product. So I'm just going to quickly create, let's just create an application really quickly. And I'll just call this, let me just show you a highlight first of all here. We've actually integrated virtualization files or CAB files within the technology here itself. So we can browse right through and quickly pick the virtualization technology. I'm just going to path to an application that's been virtualized. Primary one. Browse in here, pick my apps. I'll just go grab Adobe. You can see here I've got the CAB for Windows Mobile, the MSI, the full install, and then the SFT file. There's my manifest file. A couple of quick steps here, a couple of details for properties, and that's pretty much it. I'm done. Now, at that point, I can then create rules around that to ensure that the administrator's intent and the rules about making sure it's on your primary machine, what kind of connection you may have, free disk space, all those pre-flight things you want to double check on are validated before we go. And then to finish off, just to show you what one can look like with the different installer formats, you can see here, this is just the PowerPoint viewer installation. I've actually got the 3 types of application formats there, MSI, AppV, and Windows Mobile. So within our PowerPoint viewer installation, I'll be able to actually dynamically determine that you're maybe sitting on your Windows Mobile phone, not on your desktop inside the corporate network, and push you the CAB file of that installation instead. Those rules also equate into the AppV for streaming and non-streaming. So there's a quick look at what you can do today for Windows 7 and application virtualization with our current in-market products. And then also a very brief view that we're going to cover heavily this week about what's happening with application virtualization in our next release. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Okay, perfect. Okay, so one more topic before we wrap up, and we also have another demo, is our VDI solution. So I know a lot of you are looking at hosted desktops, and I want to share with you our technology stack and our partnership with Citrix, because we believe that we actually have really the best of breed solution to deliver that hosted desktop scenario. So when you think about VDI, certainly you need the virtualization platform to host those desktop VMs. We have that with either Windows Server 2008 R2 or Hyper-V Server R2. You need a desktop delivery mechanism, and with remote desktop services in R2, we have an integrated broker that delivers both sessions as well as VM-hosted desktops. You need an application delivery capability to those hosted desktops, and again, we have application virtualization or remote app as part of RDS. And then we have some of the core virtualization capabilities as part of the operating system itself, which is roaming profiles and folder redirection. And then we touched on earlier around the importance of management in terms of delivering and managing that end-to-end hosted desktop scenario. And then we have our core partner for desktop virtualization and VDI with Citrix with their Zen Desktop 4 product. And then over a network, we'll be able to deliver those hosted desktops across a variety of devices, whether they be traditional rich clients, thin clients, Windows embedded thin clients, et cetera. And when we think about what are some of the core differentiators for our joint solution with Citrix, it's really around making sure that we have a comprehensive portfolio, because a lot of things you want to do, such as application virtualization and session virtualization, you want to do in a hosted desktop as well as a traditional distributed desktop. So having that full portfolio is very important. A very strong focus on providing rich user experience. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, the belief that desktop virtualization is really just a component of a broader desktop management strategy and approach. I probably won't have time to walk through this slide, but we've done some scalability testing with XenDesktop 4 and Hyper-V. On the far left, there was actually a comparison. Citrix and their internal teams actually did a comparison of XenDesktop 4 with Hyper-V, Zen Server, and another virtualization vendor. And it actually shows that we actually have 11% better scalability in terms of VM density for Windows 7 compared to the next Zen Server, which came in second. And they actually ran this through their ROI tool for XenDesktop 4, where over a period of 3 years and 5,000 desktops, this increased density would help save the customer $225,000. The other scalability testing we did on the right, this was actually a paper with Citrix, Microsoft, and Intel. We actually did, again, scalability testing on some of the new Nehalem-based servers. And just focus on the far right, where we actually were able to virtualize 239 desktops on a single server. That's actually 64 logical processors. And then even under what we consider more heavy load, we were still able to achieve about 220 desktops. So Hyper-V is a strong platform to the traditional desktop, hosted desktop scenario. I think this was discussed, but certainly this was announced earlier, which is when we deliver Windows Server 2008 R2 SP1, the two main features are virtualization related and very relevant to the hosted desktop scenario. So certainly two of the barriers for a broader adoption for VDI has been around cost, because it's a little bit more of an upfront investment because you have to invest in some of the data center infrastructure, such as storage area networks. And then also user experience, which depending on your user profile, there might be very high expectations of delivering a local-like experience. So with Windows Server 2008 R2 SP1, we're delivering two features that address those concerns. First, with remote effects, this is really providing a graphic remoting capability on top of RDP that allows you to virtualize GPUs on the host server. So you're basically to do some of the host rendering and then send that composite image down to an endpoint device. This really enables a full fidelity desktop experience. And then on the right, dynamic memory, it allows you to treat your memory on the host server as a shared resource pool, and then you can dynamically reallocate the memory as needed. And this really increases the consolidation ratios and therefore decrease the cost per desktop or VM. And this works great for VDI because you can basically set the minimum boot memory for that VM. Sorry about that. Boot memory for that VM, and then allow it to access the resource pool as needed. And so for our last demo, I'm going to bring up Michael Cleef, who's going to talk to these two key features.
I don't think that was you, Di. I think that was me leaning forward too much. So how many of you saw the foundational keynote with Garth this morning? Okay, so there was one lady at lunch. I sat down at the table and I said, did you watch the foundational keynote? She went, nope, I skipped that one. It's like, okay, thanks. There she is. Ha ha. So anyway, so today you get to see it. Isn't that good? So the session that I actually did in the foundational keynote, I used one of these thin clients. So thin client like this, you'll be able to see it at the TLC theater like this afternoon. It opens this afternoon, right? Yeah, so you'll be able to see these devices. So Thin Links is there. The one that I used this morning was a pre-production prototype, and you may have noticed I had a little glitch with it. Not going to use it right now, but you'll be able to see it in demo at the TLC. So the session I'm going to show you is just an example of that again, but with a richer client desktop. So there we go. So this is a Win 7 desktop running SP1. There will be an updated terminal services client to support remote effects because there's a new codec support for it that basically lights up the protocol. So what you'll now see inside the client in some user experience areas, you noticed in the demo that I did this morning, I also showed the new capability around USB redirection. What you'll notice in the client when you go to light up that feature is you'll go into local resources and then more, and you'll see this new option that says other supported remote effects USB devices. Now we can remote just about anything into the session. So as you can see, I can do like webcams, I can do audio, I can do just about any USB device. Just as a point of note, when you get your hands on the beta, it was announced today, right? When the date was? Right. So when you get the beta, what you'll notice is this part is actually disabled by default in group policy. So what you have to do is you have to go in group policy, and you have to enable it and reboot the machine, because what it does is loads a driver for redirection. So then you'll get the capability to be able to support USB. But for those of you who haven't even seen the user experience, let's go and have a look at that first. So this is that same VM that I was using this morning in that foundational keynote. Same video, which is the Call of Duty Black Ops video. So if I hit play, you can see this is running perfectly, right? Now, it's interesting that in Server 2008 R2, we actually made a couple of changes, just without SP1. Firstly, we enabled this thing called multimedia redirection. And basically what occurs is most of the rendering occurs at the back-end remote desktop session host server, what was formerly known as a terminal server. But for stuff like multimedia, it can actually redirect the primitives for the media to the local client, and then you use the local GPU to actually render that. Now with remote effects, we can actually push that all completely to the back. So if I've got one of those ultralight thin clients, all the rendering occurs at the back end because we're using the GPU on the server end. Now in a richer client desktop where I actually have a GPU, we can go into a hybrid mode. What we can actually do is for videos like this, we can actually send the primitives down the wire and let it render locally at the client. The advantage that gives us is lower bandwidth. But for stuff like AutoCAD, which is purely 3D, we can completely render that at the back end. So we actually get the best of both worlds hybrid. So if you want to use a richer client, you're going to get some efficiency. If you want to use the ultralight thin client, you get a device that basically requires 3 watts of power and all the GPU occurs at the back end. So letting that occur, we'll just minimize that down. We'll hit play again, and I'll just restore it like that. So what I want to do is go to the hypervisor so you can see what's actually occurring at the server end. So you can see the GPU is still in action, and what you see on the green line is the GPU in action. This is just like Windows 7 desktop, where the GPU is responsible for drawing the screen and doing all the high-definition experience, and then the processor does what it does best, which is computational load. Now, when I run something like AutoCAD, so you can see the video finished, obviously, when I run something like AutoCAD, because that's computationally heavy and graphically heavy, you see both counters jump. So as it redraws the model and you pan around, you see the CPU do stuff, and you see the GPU do stuff. So it's really quite efficient in the way it actually uses resources. And we think it's going to be very interesting for some advanced data visualization capabilities, or anywhere you really require 3D capabilities, such as geospatial modeling, oil and gas, CAD, that kind of application as well. So that gives you a bit of an example of what's occurring there. Do we want to show dynamic memory as well? Do we have time? We probably don't have time for that. But I'm sure there'll be other sessions where you'll get to see dynamic memory. And of course, I'm going to be talking a bit more about VDI in my session tomorrow at 1:30. I'm going to be talking about capacity planning and what you've got to consider in choices of VDI to sessions. Thank you, Di.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so I think we're over. But I just want to close by saying, hopefully we've demonstrated the 3 core elements of our virtualization strategy, which again, what do we do to make it as pervasive as possible? How do we preserve customer investments? And how do we establish management as a key enabler across the desktop, the data center, and the cloud? And so for a specific call to action, certainly make sure you learn about our virtualization solutions. Make sure you look at desktop virtualization, because that's a key catalyst as part of why customers are looking at desktop virtualization with Windows 7. And then certainly prepare for the cloud and continue to virtualize your infrastructure. Thank you very much.